Right, so welcome everybody to this webinar where we're going to be looking at marking online, and we're going to be focusing on rubrics, grading and feedback. And I'm just going to put my video on very briefly at the start, just to say hi to everybody. So hi and welcome to the webinar today. I am Kath and I'm working with SILT, and I do have my colleague here with me today as well, Chengwen. So I'm going to hand over to Chengwen to say hi to you.
Hi everyone. So yeah, I'm Cheng Wei, working in the academic staff development team. So yeah, welcome. Nice to have you all.
Thanks, Chengwen.
Thank you.
Great, and it's good to have our colleagues here with us today. And as we're going through the various aspects that we're going to chat about today, seeing as there's a fairly small number of us here, you're welcome to add questions into the text chat area, or if you would like to, you can also use the raise hand icon and you're perfectly welcome to speak so we can address any of your questions that you might have as we're going through the presentation. So as you can see, we're going to be talking about rubrics, grading and feedback. So let's have a quick look at the agenda, what we're going to be covering today. We're basically going to look at the landscape of grading and feedback tools that exist specifically within the Vula context. I know Chengwen did speak about the other learning platform, but we're going to focus and concentrate on Vula today. So we're going to be looking at rubrics, and then we'll take a look at tests and quizzes, assignments and discussions as being tools where submissions are graded and how you would go about setting those up. And then we'll also look at Gradebook and a few other tools that exist that can also be used for providing feedback to students along the way during various activities within Vula. So first of all, we're going to have an overview of grading and feedback. And at this point, I'm going to hand over to Chengwen to tell us a bit more about that.
So we're going to first begin with, general good practices for providing feedback. And so beginning with kind of a key principle, which is we want to think about feeding forward. Okay, so the feedback that we provide should direct or help students progress towards their final goal. So feeding forward, providing them the type of feedback that can kind of be transferred to kind of the next assignments or future assignments. So to do this, we need to make sure that we provide meaningful feedback, meaningful and constructive feedback, which allows them to improve. So terms like, just saying great job or not quite there yet doesn't quite provide insight to what is not done well or, how the work can be improved. So when you're giving feedback, make sure you're thinking about the type of feedback that can help them improve, whether what's identifying what they're doing right at the moment or wrong at the moment, so they can help them improve. And then also presentation of the feedback is important, the use of language and tone, because language and tone can make a difference towards kind of building confidence or motivation or reducing it. So usually good practice kind of guides advise that we start with the positive aspects, like giving praises, but also to be sure that when we give these positive aspects, we are sincere in them, because students will identify, they will know that, when a comment is not sincere, and then they might dismiss other comments as well. So try to find elements that are positive, but, that the actual positive aspects that you're sincere in how you give your feedback. And of course, timing is better, the sooner the better. So research suggests that immediate feedback increases performance. This is now possible through kind of online assessment like quizzes. You can configure it into the system and provide immediate feedback. But where it's assignments that need marking and you can't provide feedback, then at least in time for the next assignment is ideal, so that they can learn from the feedback and then feed it and kind of draw on it for the next assignments. Then feedback doesn't always need to come from the lecturer. You can leverage on student feedback. And so this might not only just kind of lessen the workload, but it's also great in promoting students' critical awareness. They can develop awareness of what's good work and also diagnose their own problems. But it is important that for peer feedback to work well, it is important that students are provided explicit guidelines or criteria and rubrics, as well as opportunities to use practice. So these are just kind of general practices or general tips on providing good feedback. Now we're going to look at the tools landscape. What available tools there are.
Great, thanks, Chengwen. Right, so which tools would you use within Vula, and how would you make them available to you within your course site? So once you're in your course site within Vula, the place to add these tools would be in Site Setup, and then you would go to the Manage Tools tab within Site Setup. So the tools that we recommend that you add would be assignments, discussions, which was formerly called forums, and tests and quizzes. You might find, if you have other lecturers that are teaching on your site with you, that they may have added these tools already, but these three tools, assignments, discussions, and tests and quizzes, are the primary tools where you'd be able to receive submissions from students and have gradable submissions, which could then feed through to the gradebook. And then other supporting tools, which you may want to add at the same time, would be rubrics that Chengwen is going to tell us a little bit more about shortly, as well as Gradebook. And then we're also going to tell you a little bit about Dropbox and Postum and how you could actually use those two tools for providing feedback as well. So as we said, within Vula, the tools which primarily have gradable submissions would be tests and quizzes, assignments, and forums. And if you've used these tools, you'll probably be fairly familiar with the options that are available within each of them and how the submissions are received from students and how you are able to grade those. But we are going to touch on that during this webinar as well. So those are the primary tools. And then on the next slide, you'll be able to see the supporting tools that we referred to as being rubrics and gradebook. So while those don't actually support submissions, those we've put them under supporting tools because rubrics would provide a grading mechanism, and gradebook would provide a mechanism for keeping track of the grades and the scores which had been received. And the other two tools on the right hand side there, you can see Dropbox and Postum. Those two tools provide a way for you to send feedback or provide something to the student directly, which could also be used as a feedback mechanism. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Chengwen again to tell us a bit more about rubrics.
Okay, so a rubric typically has three essential features. That's the evaluative criteria, kind of the criteria in which an assignment will be graded against. And then there's a scoring strategy, which kind of outlines the quality at different levels, and then quality definitions at each level as well. So these are kind of the three essential features of a rubric. So rubrics can serve different purposes because they have different uses. So for instructors, they can provide targeted marking and feedback. And this, of course, can then make the marking process more efficient and quicker because you know what to look for. So and so when you see something, you can just tick. Okay. Then, of course, it can provide consistency in marking. Because you know that you're assessing a set piece of criteria, and then it can also be employed as a mechanism to map the alignment between course learning outcomes and what is being assessed. That is, you can look at your assessment criteria and see if these kind of align with your learning outcomes. Then, of course, for students, they make explicit the assessment expectations. And by doing so, this can kind of help reduce anxiety because they know what to prepare for. And it can also promote self-regulated learning as they can then turn those assessment criteria into learning goals. Okay, so these are just some purposes of the rubric. But to effectively make use of rubric, it is important that students are presented with the rubric upfront so they know what they should be preparing for and how they should target elements of the assessment task. And it is also important that the rubric is unpacked and contextualized. So you should discuss the criteria with the students so they know what you mean by each of the criteria. And so where the rubric is being used to kind of establish consistency among multiple markers, it is important to kind of establish a common understanding of the criteria and descriptors prior to the marking. Okay, So there are two common types of rubrics, the analytic and the holistic. So this is what an analytic rubric look like, and an advantage. So they have the criteria outlined and scores with lots of descriptions in between. Okay. So an advantage of this type of rubric is obviously transparency, because you know specifically what you're being assessed, and they provide targeted feedback, where areas that you should improve. And it, of course, allows one to easily justify the score. The disadvantage of this type of rubric is that it does take time to create, because you need to fill in all the descriptors of the blocks. And it might be difficult to write the descriptors for each cell, because you need to differentiate. It does take time to read, so a student might not read it if there are too many. Okay, so these are some points to consider if you're creating an analytic rubric. Analytic rubric is also known as an instructional rubric, because this is the type of rubric that is actually encouraged, because if you provide this type of rubric to students, and they can know where to improve. Whereas the next one, the holistic rubric, kind of lumps the criteria together. So this is more of a scoring rubric. So for the assessor, it's kind of easier because you just tick, so it's easy to grade and create. But as you see, it doesn't provide targeted feedback. And so in terms of instructional use, it's harder for students, it's harder to know where to improve. For example, let's say if a 3 was ticked here, you just know that you have some elements of all these things correct or done well, but you don't know specifically which is it. So if it's a research paper, you don't know if it's specifically the kind of where did you go wrong? Was it the thesis statement, or was it the writing, and so on. So this is kind of less useful for students. Right, now we go on to the technical bit. Back to you, Kath.
Thanks, Chengwen. Right, so now that you've had a bit of an insight into what kind of rubrics there are available and when you might possibly want to use these, how do you actually get them into your Vula site? So we've mentioned already that you're going to go to Site Setup and Manage Tools and add that particular tool. So once it's added, you will see the rubric link will be provided on the left-hand navigation for you. And when you're on the rubrics page, it will look like this, and you will see two headings. One will be site rubrics and one will be public rubrics. So these headings you can expand, and you will be able to see the rubrics that are below under those headings. So just to let you know, site rubrics will be the ones which are specific to your particular site. And then the public rubrics are rubrics which have been created by others, but they've decided to make them public, and public means that they are shareable. So they might have created a rubric for their particular course site, but they think that it might be useful for others. So when they create it, they actually make it public, which means it's in their course site and it can be seen by you and anybody else in the other course sites as well. And the advantage of this is if you are wanting to create a rubric for your site, you could actually copy one of the public rubrics and use that as a starting point or a template to actually create your rubric. So the way you would go about it if you were going to create your own rubric is to actually click the button which is New Rubric, and it will give you a very basic starting point such as you are seeing on the screen at the moment. So you can see that it's titled New Rubric, so that's the default name, which you can obviously personalize, and will give you a couple of criteria there. You can see criterion 1, criterion 2. So everywhere that you see the edit icon, so the edit icon is the square with a small pencil in it. You can see it next to the title, you can see it next to the criteria name. Those are all editable. So they give you this basic outline to start with, but you can really tweak it and change it any way that you want to. So you can also see on the top bar on the right-hand side, there's a number of icons there. So the first one that looks like a hash symbol, that is if you would like to switch between a weighted rubric as opposed to a standard rubric. So they call it weighted and standard. Standard is the one which uses percentages. And then the next icon along, which looks like a little eye with a stripe through it. So you can see that that is not public at the moment. So it means it's just for your site. So if you want to think the opposite of public would be private or just for your site, at the moment that indicates that this is just for your site. If you click that little eye, it will then toggle it and make it public, which means it's for your site and also available and freely accessible by anybody else. You can also make a copy of this rubric. So if you had made something for your site and then you wanted to use it again for maybe subsequent assignments or tests and quizzes, you could use the copy icon, and the X will be to remove this rubric completely. So as you can see, it gives you some basic criteria, and you can change the name of each of those different levels that are there. You can also decide to add more levels if you want to, or take levels away. And you can also adapt the points that are there as well. The three little stripes that you see next to each of these items, like the criteria and each of the levels within the criteria, those are actually drag handles. So you can actually grab each of those elements and drag them around. So if you decided to reorder the levels or reorder the criteria that you created, you could use the little drag handles to move the items around. And similarly, if you wanted some additional criteria to be added to your rubric, you would use the button in the left-hand corner that says add criterion, and you would add a new row. So each row is an individual criteria on the rubric. You can also, it's just giving you a little example there of how you can actually rename the different levels. So you can see the one there that is poor. You can actually change the rating title, and that is where you could also add in your descriptions. Remember, Chengun was showing you the analytical rubric that had titles and a lot of descriptions. This is where you would add in your descriptors for each of the different levels. So as you can see, it's very flexible. But could possibly be quite time consuming in setting it up. And that is why it's worth actually putting in quite a bit of thought beforehand as to how you would actually want to use this rubric and how much detail you might want to provide. So on the next slide, you will see there that just to note that once you've created your rubrics, and if you've used this rubric to attach to an item that's will be submitted, like an assignment or test and quiz, you will see a little lock icon will appear next to it. And that means that this rubric is then locked to that item. And once it is locked to that item, and you might have potentially received submissions from a student, or you might even have started using your rubric to grade some of the submissions, once the lock icon is there, you cannot edit the rubric. So if you have received a couple of submissions and you've maybe graded those submissions and you're waiting for the rest of the class to still submit, and you decide you want to actually change the rubric because you maybe decide you need another criteria, or you want to change some of the levels, you cannot do that because it is then locked until all of those submissions are actually marked. So that's just something to note. And also, again, just harks back to the fact of thinking carefully when creating the rubric before attaching it to an item. So let's see how you would attach a rubric to an assignment. So we're going to take a look at assignments now. And when you're actually setting up an assignment, under the grading option, that is where you would actually be linking your rubric at that point. So under the grading option, it's just showing you that particular point on the assignment setup at the moment. You will see a radio button there that says use the following rubric to grade this assignment. So just by that statement, you can see that you do first of all create your rubric, and then you attach the rubric to the actual item. So once you select use the following rubric to grade the assignment, it will give you a drop-down list, and it will show you all of your rubrics that you have created. So you choose from the list as to which rubric you would like to assign to this actual assignment. You can also choose if you would like to adjust individual students' scores. So that means that you can use the rubric, but then you can override it should you decide maybe something's worth an extra half mark, or you want to change something. If you select that, then you can still alter the scores as well. And then, of course, you most probably want to send these scores through to Gradebook. So it will be recommended to select that option to send the grades to the Gradebook. And if you had set up your Gradebook with categories, you could optionally elect to send the mark through to Gradebook in the selected category as well. So remember that you need to set up your rubric first, then attach it, and then tell it to actually send that mark through to Gradebook. So when you are actually grading an assignment, a submission that may have come in from a student, next to the assignment, you will actually see the little rubric icon. So you can see it looks like a little table almost. So that tells you that this particular assignment has a rubric attached to it. So when you're going to be grading submissions that have actually come through, on the next slide, you'll be able to see this is an example of a submission that has been sent through. Next to the grading option, you'll see that little icon again, that little rubric icon that looks like a table. And once you click that, your selected rubric will actually pop up. And this is where you will actually use the rubric to score or to grade the submission just by clicking on the different levels. And then depending on the marks that you've assigned to those levels, it will total it up for you. You can also see on the right-hand side, there is something that looks like a little speech bubble, and this is common on all rubrics, and this is where you can actually add additional feedback. So this little speech bubble you'll see is an option where you can provide feedback per criteria. So at the end of each criteria row, you will see the speech bubble and it'll just pop up a little window as it shows below there where you can add in your comment and then just click the done button and it will save that comment. So it's not mandatory, but it's another space where you can actually add additional feedback. And you will also see on the left-hand side, you can also add sort of high-level overview feedback as well using the add feedback button. So if you just wanted to add some kind of global high-level feedback, that is another space that you could add it as well. And then once you click save, that will be saved, and as long as you have set it up so that the feedback is supplied and made available to the student. I'm just picking up on a question here that Kamla put into the chat area. And he was asking, if you make a rubric public, can you limit the number of people who can have access? You can't actually limit it, Kamla. It's basically like a toggle switch. So it's either private or public. So once it's public, then any other Vula site who is also using rubrics will see it listed in their list of publicly available rubrics. You couldn't sort of ring fence it to just a designated group of people. Thanks for that question. Right, so that's how you would grade an assignment using a rubric. So let's have another look at another example using a test and quiz. How would you attach a rubric within a test and quiz? Now, this is slightly different because remember that a test and quiz could contain a variety of different question types. And some of the question types that are within a test and quiz are self-marking or get marked automatically, and that will be things like multiple choice or true and false, where there's definitely a definitive right answer. But you also have some questions where you need to manually go in and actually mark it yourself. So that will be something like an essay question, where you would actually go in. And these are the question types where you can actually attach a rubric. So on the next slide, you'll be able to see there that the rubric actually gets attached not at the test and quiz level, but actually to the question itself. So here is an example where I've used a file upload question. So this might be the only question. It's possible that it's the only question within this test and quiz, and your whole test and quiz actually is one question where all you're asking them to do is upload a file. Or this could be one question within a test and quiz where there's some other questions which are marked automatically, but the rubric gets added at the question level, not at the test and quiz level. So here is a file upload option. And you can see under the grading section for this particular question where I've asked them to upload a file, it says use the following rubric to grade the assignment. Okay, so that is where you would choose from the drop-down list. Very similar at this point to the assignment is that your rubric would have been created first. You would then attach it to this particular question. And this is a question where you would be manually grading it using the rubric because you couldn't automatically kind of mark a file upload. It would kind of make sense that you would like to look at that file that the student had submitted and manually mark it. So this is where you would attach the rubric. And if you wanted to, again, you could select that option to adjust individual student scores, which gives you the ability to add extra marks or to make slight adjustments if you wanted to. So that is attaching a rubric to a question within a test and quiz. That would be the question is manually marked. So on the next slide, you'll be able to see there that the rubric looks very similar to the way it looked within the assignment. And when you actually go in and mark this, you'll see a tab at the top where it says grading rubric. So if you've attached a rubric, you'll see a tab that says grading rubric. And when you click that, you'll be presented with the rubric that you had created. And very similar to the other way that the rubric worked in assignment, you can add comments at the end of each criteria, and you can the points would be automatically tallied up depending on which level you were selecting. But as you had also selected the option to be able to adjust the scores slightly, you could actually also type in your own score there as well. And as with assignments, there is a section for comments for the student where you can have a global overall comment if you wanted to. Remember, these are all optional. You could also provide additional feedback by adding an attachment if you wanted to. And there's also a link there at the bottom where you can actually email the student directly. So that's another channel that you could use for providing feedback to the student as well. You could actually email them directly. And once you'd added whichever methods or feedback that you wanted to provide, you would just click the update button at the bottom left-hand corner to actually send this through and to make this available to the student. Right, now we're going to have a look at discussions. So discussions is the other tool where students could have submissions and they are gradable submissions. So you can actually mark submissions or contributions within discussions. Remember, discussions is the new name that is currently used for forums. So with discussions, it is slightly different that you need to do things in a particular order. So we know that in all instances, you need to create your rubric first. That's the first thing you're always going to do is create your rubric first, and then you usually attach it to the item. So with your discussion or your forum contributions, again, you're going to create your rubric first. But what you have to do is you have to actually attach that rubric to a gradebook item. That's the first thing you have to do. So you create an item in Gradebook, which you will be using for your discussion submissions. And when you're creating that Gradebook item, you can see under grading rubric, there is that familiar option where it says use the following rubric to grade the assignment. And from there, you would actually choose from the drop-down list which rubric you would be attaching to this Gradebook item. So that's the first step. And then you would click Save Changes at the bottom. Then the next step is when you're actually setting up your discussion under grading, it will then ask you which Gradebook item you would like to associate this with. And because the rubric has now been attached to the Gradebook item, just by assigning the discussion to the Gradebook item, it would make the rubric available. So just to remember that this one is slightly different, and an extra step is first the Gradebook item, attach the rubric to the Gradebook item, then attach the Gradebook item to that particular discussion. So on the next slide, you will then see what this looks like when you're actually going to go in and grade discussion. So similarly, the rubric icon appears next to that particular discussion. So you can see a forum topic there called Activity 1 Introduction, and it has that familiar little icon in the front. So you know this is something that's going to be graded using a rubric. When you actually go into that discussion and you have a look at the comments or the replies which have been put there, you will see an option to click on the grade button for that particular contribution by that student. And once you click on the grade button, a little window will pop up, which will actually show you the rubric which has been associated with this. And as you will see, there's also a general comment area as well. So you can comment for each of the criteria, or you can use that general comment area right at the top to provide feedback. And once you'd completed that, you would just need to click the submit grade at the bottom corner, and that would send that through to Gradebook for you. Right, so that's how you would attach your rubrics to each of those different tools: assignments, test and quizzes at a question level, and discussions. So let's have a look at some other options that exist for scoring and for providing feedback comments on those tools other than using rubrics. So the first one we're going to have a look at is assignments. So you've seen how to attach a rubric in an assignment. So what other methods are available to provide scoring and feedback to students? So when you're setting up the assignment, as we've seen before, you can also choose to just have points, a point system. So at the top there, you can see the first thing you would select under grading would be to grade this assignment. If you had not selected to grade the assignment, that means it's an ungraded submission. So in other words, that means there's no points assigned. You're not going to be providing any feedback, but usually you would want to grade the assignment. So you must check the box that says grade this assignment. Then it will ask you what kind of scale you would like to use. Is it going to be percentages? Is it going to be points? And you choose from the drop-down list. This example has shown points, and I have put in there that the maximum points I'm going to be giving for this assignment is 100 points. So under that, you can see there that because I'm using points now as opposed to a rubric, I have the option selected there that says do not use a rubric to grade this assignment. So you can see it's either going to be using a rubric to grade, or you use the points system. So at the moment, we're using the points system, so we do not elect to use a rubric. And then below that, the very important one to check is to send the grades to Gradebook. So here you can decide to create a brand new gradebook item. If you select that option, it will be titled the same as the title of this particular assignment. It will create that automatically for you if you choose to create a new gradebook item. Or if you already have an existing gradebook item, because maybe you've set up all the items manually in Gradebook in advance, you can choose to associate it with an existing gradebook item. So that is the setup that's required in advance to make sure that you can actually mark your assignment. Then when you get submissions, the way that you would mark this on the next slide, you'll be able to see that if you had submissions, so you can see in the column that says in new, there's one submission that has been sent through from a student here. You could either click on that where it says 1 out of 1, or you could click on the link under the name of the assignment that says grade. So if you click on grade, it'll take you through to the grading area. So on the next slide, you'll see the grading area. And here is actually an interesting opportunity to be able to send feedback to multiple students. So say there was some similar feedback that you needed to send to maybe 12 out of your 50 students. This is an option on this page where you can actually provide feedback in this general area here, and then elect to send the same feedback to all of the selected students. So that's just an important thing to note there, that that is possible to send similar feedback to multiple students at once. If you were going to be grading a submission an individual submission. On the next slide, you'll be able to see that the grading, a good thing to choose there would be to say, use the new grader to grade submissions, because that gives you a nice interface to be able to work with for each of the submissions that are sent through by the student. So here's an example where we have a submission here from myself. So to access this submission, you would just click on the student's name. And once you click on the student's name on the next slide, you will see that submission from the student. So here's an example where they've submitted a PDF. So you can see it actually loads in the grader for you. And here on the right-hand side are your options to provide your point system next to grade. And you'll see there's also a comment feedback area where you can provide a comment, and you can also add attachments as well. And then below that, you'll see a button that says private notes. So private notes are only for yourself or other people that have either site owner or support staff access. The student will never see private notes. So if you want to make a little note about the submission, you could do that over there, and the student would not have access to that. So once you'd added your grades and your feedback, you would just click on save at the bottom of the screen there. So that is pretty straightforward for setting up and being able to provide scoring and feedback to submissions in assignments. So let's see how you would add scoring and feedback in the test and quizzes scenario. So within test and quizzes, when you're actually setting it up, you will find this in the grading section, which is called grading and feedback. So this is when you're first setting up your test and quiz, you need to go to the grading and feedback area to be able to set this up initially. So once you expand that area, grading and feedback, you will see on the next slide, it'll show you some options pertaining to grading. And one of the important ones to actually tick there is to send the assessment score to Gradebook immediately. So that means that the score will be sent through to your Gradebook. And if you already set up categories in your Gradebook, you could optionally select to send it to a predefined category over there. So you can see here we've got category week 1, but these are, as it says, completely optional as long as you have elected to send it through to the Gradebook, because that's the important part. Then on the next slide, you'll be able to see that when you are actually scoring and commenting, once you have received submissions for your test and quiz, there is a comment area right at the top level where you can actually provide a comment, which is like a high level comment on that whole submission. And if you've elected to be able to adjust the scores as well, you can also edit the scores right here on this page and manually edit the scores. And once you had added comments or changed any scores, you would have to click on the update button at the bottom left. And here we can see that when you are scoring a particular question, so here is a question within the test and quiz. This is just one question. I've just print screened that. You can actually also update the points right there on that particular question as well. So if you wanted to change the points for a particular question manually, you could actually go in and change the points there as well. And then again, similarly, you would just click the update button to save any changes you might have applied at a question level. Right, so that's an overview of tests and quizzes and being able to provide scores and feedback and comments. Let's have a look at how you would do this for discussions. So how can you grade discussions not using a rubric, but using, say, a point system instead? So the way to do this is you can either set it at the forum level under forum settings, or you can set it at the topic level under a particular topic. So you would go into the settings, either the forum level or the topic level. And then once you are in the settings, you will find a section there pertaining to grading, which we've seen similarly on the other slides, and it will be on the gradebook item. You would select a particular gradebook item that the score would be entered into the gradebook against. So remember, similarly to the way we set up discussions when we were using rubrics, you would set up your gradebook item in advance and then associate the contributions within the forum to that particular gradebook item. Then on the next slide, you'll be able to see that when you're actually marking a contribution within the discussion forum, you would click on the grade button and a very similar little window would pop up, except now we wouldn't be using a rubric, we would be actually using a mark. So we would have our gradebook item and we would have associated it with that item in the grade book. Then in the next field, you can enter the grade, which is the points that you want to assign for that particular contribution. And here again, we have an area where you can provide comment on that particular contribution as well. So remember that the comments are optional. They are very useful to students if you have the time to complete and provide comments on each contribution. It can become quite time consuming. So it's a way to provide feedback, but just think carefully beforehand, as Chengwen said, what is going to be suitable feedback, and if you have time to actually provide feedback at this level for each student. Once you'd added in your grades and your comments, you would just click on Submit Grade. Right, now we mentioned that there are some supporting tools within Vula other than assignments, tests and quizzes, and discussions, which have gradable submissions from the student side. And we've already mentioned quite a bit about how this links up with Gradebook, but we're just going to take a quick look at Gradebook now. We're not going to delve into how to set it up, but we're just going to have a quick look within Gradebook itself. You'll be able to see there on the next slide that it also provides an area for you to add comments as well. So for each student that you have within your Gradebook setup, at the end, you'll be able to see a very similar little speech bubble. This looks very similar to the speech bubble that was on the rubric. That is where you can actually add an additional comment. So if there was something that you particularly wanted to draw the student's attention to on a particular grade, this little speech bubble or comment feature exists for every grade that is within Gradebook. So if you wanted to make a particular comment, this is where you could do it just by clicking on the little drop down arrow, entering your comment, and once a comment had been added, this little speech bubble would appear, which would indicate to you as a lecturer that a comment had been added at this point, and a student would see it as inline text feedback on this particular mark. So we've had a look at Gradebook now. So what other feedback opportunities exist within Vula? Okay, I'm just having a look quickly in the chat here. I'm seeing from Michelle is saying, can we ever give verbal feedback? Right, so there is a way to do that, Michelle, while it is not kind of immediate within the environment itself. So when you were grading things like the assignment and the test and quizzes, remember there was an option there to add an attachment. So what you could do is you could actually record your audio feedback, and then that would produce an audio file on your local computer, and then you could attach that as feedback. So while it's not kind of integrated within the actual interface, you could add pre-recorded feedback, verbal feedback, as an attachment onto that actual submission.
Just an advertisement in the new learning platform that's possible to add verbal feedback directly onto an assignment. So all the more reason to stop over soon.
Absolutely, yes, you can do that. And it's integrated, as Chengwen says, right there within the interface. Right, so two other opportunities actually exist to provide feedback. While it's not sort of immediate grading, it is an opportunity to actually connect one-on-one with the students within the Vula environment. And one of those is Dropbox. So as the name implies, this is an area that is shared between just the designated student and you as the lecturer. So anybody that's in the site owner or the support staff role could have access to the Dropbox. So you would see the drop boxes, which are essentially like a shared folder of all of the students, but the student themselves would only see their own Dropbox. So if you want to share a file, which may be a feedback file, it may be comments and some marks if you wanted to, this would be an opportunity where you could upload feedback to students straight into the shared folders. So you would see all of the shared folders, and the student would only receive what they had in their designated folder. Similarly, a student could also maybe work on something and actually drop it into their Dropbox, and then you would see this little star on the folder, which would indicate that there's a new submission there. You could actually go in and see what the student had supplied to you. So this is another way that you could communicate directly and share items from you to a student and from a student back to you again. That is the use of Dropbox. Two important areas within Dropbox to take a look at would be transfer files and also upload files to multiple Dropbox folders. So transfer files would be where you're moving files in and out of the folders, and there's very comprehensive instructions within the Dropbox tool as to how you do this, and it's pretty seamless. And the upload files to multiple Dropboxes is where you might have one particular file and you want to send it to lots of students, maybe like a group of students within your student body. You could upload one file and send it to a group of students by selecting their names from the drop-down list. So that's a quick way to move files back and forth. And one other tool I'd like to draw your attention to that exists within Vula is a tool called Postum. So Postum is using a CSV file. So as you will know, if you use a CSV file, it's not rich text, it's basic, it's just the basic text. But the beauty of this is it essentially works within your Excel interface. You can draw up the file within Excel and work with a CSV file there. And then what you would do is it's a single data file where you would have all of your students and you would have the various fields. You could decide which fields you wanted to have, if you wanted to provide feedback comment, or if you wanted to provide a mark, or if you wanted to provide due dates. And you would upload this single file, the CSV file, and by virtue of the first column, the first field being the student unique identifier, which is their student number, only the designated student would see the feedback for them. So you could add things like you would have to add a title for your file that you would be uploaded. You would upload your CSV file, it's straight from your machine, or it could be in the resources folder within Vula. And then you could also decide when to actually release this to the participants. So you could add it in advance and say, I only want this to become available as of Monday next week. And you could add that in, and then you would just post it through to the students. Another useful thing is that sending this one file through means that each of the individual students only see their designated feedback. But on the next slide, you can see that once you've posted this through, you can actually go in and see which of the students has actually reviewed their feedback. So you would get an overview of which students had seen it, and in the column on the extreme right you would see something that says last checked, and you could see when that student had checked or if they had never checked. Any student that has never checked, their name would be highlighted in bold red font, so you'd be able to see if a student had gone in and actually reviewed the feedback that you'd sent them using the Postum tool. Right, so this is a very fast overview of all the sort of grading feedback options that exist within the Vula context. And thanks for the questions that have been put forward in the text chat. And I'm just going to check in with the attendees today. Are there any other questions at this point, maybe about some of the tools that you have used, or maybe there's something that's you've seen here today which is new and you would like more information about it? Anything that you would like to ask at this point?
Thank you. That was great. It's Michelle here.
Hi,
Can you hear
Michelle.
me?
Yes, I can.
The
Yes.
postum thing, is it in one of the site tools things that we can add?
Yes, it is 100%. So if you go to your site setup and then you go to manage tools, you'll see there it's called Postum. So once that tool is added, then you'll be able to work with the CSV file and upload that to provide the feedback to the students. You must just make sure that you're using the student numbers, their unique identifiers, because that is what actually sends that feedback to that particular student.
Okay. And this changeover from Vula, are we going to be ever using Vula again then after this changeover, do you think?
So what's going to happen is there is a bit of a kind of a handover period. So Vula will be around for the next year or two, and there'll be a gradual changeover. There's a very kind of phased approach of moving courses in a very designated and scheduled fashion onto the new learning platform, which will be Amatuba. And there's a lot of information about that. So once all of the courses have actually moved over to Amatuba, then I think Vula will be resigned and we won't be coming back to Vula again.
Okay, but all our stuff that's already on Vula, I assume, will be transferred to our new site on Amatuba.
Yeah, so it depends if, yeah, this, as I said, there's quite a bit of info on the SILT site about that. And it depends if it's an active site where students are obviously engaging in it, or if you're talking about archived content, which would be, say, courses which had run, say, like 3, 4, 5 years ago. So there's going to be a slightly different approach to both of those.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks so much. That was great.
Thanks, Michelle. And Kamala, I see you have a question here in the text chat talking about how is the gradebook set up? Is it automatically when the students register for the course or manually? So it's actually a little bit of both. So first of all, when you add the first thing is to actually add the gradebook tool to your site using site setup and manage tools and then select gradebook. Then as soon as you add students, active students onto your site, their names will appear in the gradebook. So that is an automatic part. The students that are registered on your site will appear listed in your gradebook. Then to actually get items into your gradebook and decide how you would like to set up your gradebook, whether you're going to be using points or whether you're going to be using percentages or whether you're going to be using weighting within your gradebook. Those are some of the options that you yourself can manually set up. And as far as items go, as you've seen when you're creating assignments or tests and quizzes, in some instances, you can elect for a gradebook item to be created automatically when you create that assignment or create that test and quiz, or you can actually create items in your gradebook manually. So it's a little bit of both.
All right, thank you.
Okay, great. Right, any other questions at this stage? I know this has been quite a lot to go through and we've gone through it pretty fast, but we have been recording the session and we will share that with you afterwards as well as the slides so that you can go back and review anything. And similarly, if you have any other questions or need assistance with implementing any of this within your course sites, please send an email to help@Vula and we'll be happy to assist you.
Just to mention, to add on to what Michelle was asking with regards to transfer to Amatuba, the lecturer actually has to activate it through Vula to say we want to do the migration. There's a button to press on Vula. So if you don't press that button, it won't transfer it for you automatically. So there are steps to follow. If you want to transfer your course, you have to activate it through your Vula course, through a press of a button. There's some steps to follow, yeah.
100%. Thanks, Chengwen. Right. So if there aren't any questions, further questions at this stage, thank you very much for coming to the webinar today, and I hope it was helpful and gave you some tips and pointers. And thank you very much to Chengwen as well for being here, my colleague who has presented with me, and for Max as well. I know Max is in the background setting it up and doing all the recording. So thank you very much for coming, and have a good day. Have a good rest of your day.